Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcast. I am Deborah Levine, editor of the ADR and your host. And with me today is Mike Bernhardt. He is an award-winning writer whose work has appeared in many different print and online publications, including Dive Magazine, Journey Beyond Travel, GeoX Travel, and Hidden Compass. He's also the editor of Voices of the Grieving Heart, an anthology of grief poetry. His new short story for Hidden Compass, The Tides of War, explores his search for what happened to his wife's grandparents during World War II, a topic that it means a great deal to many of us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. And let's start off with a question about all this writing. How did you get started with all that?
Well, when I was in my teens, I was angst-ridden, like many teens, and I wrote poetry to kind of express that. And then I kept journals, and then as my life went on, I didn't do any writing for a long time. And then I was married, my first wife died, and again, I found myself writing poetry and to deal with that. And then I remarried and started a new life, and that faded away again. And then when I retired from my IT career, I thought, I would love to do some writing again. And I started doing some travel writing, which initially was just a blog. My wife started a work project in Morocco for almost 2 months. And I went along for the ride, and I thought, well, I'll just kind of write about what I'm experiencing. I would wander around the Medinas while she was working, and I wrote about that. And I found I really enjoyed writing again, and not having to write my pain, but to write things that I enjoyed writing about. So so that's kind of how I got started with that. And the book we can talk about later, but that's a whole other thing that grew out of the grief. So,
right.
And and then this story, The Tides of War, was sort of a different project for me because it was about travel partially, but not entirely. Sort of melded a number of different things that were important to me.
It's amazing what we end up writing about, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's wonderful because people get to hear a voice that otherwise they wouldn't. So I'm delighted that you've done all this. And I know that we're going to talk about the Tides of War and what that's all about. But before we get to that, just a few moments on the grief poetry, which people need to hear about.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us.
Well, the thing with poetry is that it tends to come from a different part of the brain than even journal writing. So, and this is something that I've learned since. I was writing poetry because I was driven to write poetry about my wife's death, not about her death so much, but about my experience afterward. And it was just a way to get onto paper really strong feelings that were stuck inside. But a lot of it was through imagery, not directly writing about this is how I feel. And what I've since learned is that poetry can access a different part of the brain, and it makes it easier to put into words things that can be impossible to put into words. I mean, how do you express, that sort of pain? And I know you've had your own losses. So, how do you put that into words in any sort of a logical way? But images can be very, very powerful way to express feelings. And then when I would look at my poems, I could look at it and say, yeah, that's what I was feeling. That's what I'm feeling now. And so it had a very healing quality to it.
Absolutely. I started writing poetry when I was about 8 or 9, when we first came to America, and I missed Bermuda and my grandparents so much. I
Mm.
journaled and I wrote poetry and I kept going. So I didn't know back then that it accessed a different part of the brain. It just was.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and often my journal writing would turn into a poem because I'd be trying to explain to myself what I was feeling. And then there would be an image that would just sort of pop into my head, and I would just kind of, the image would become a poem.
Yeah. So you've taken this experience and this skill and applied it, right, to this story about World War II, which is,
Yeah,
I've always found to be quite challenging to write about. It is very emotional when your family is involved. Yeah.
yeah.
So, what made you decide to go in that direction to write that Tides of War?
Well, so my wife's grandmother was 103 years old when she died in 1997.
Wow.
And yeah, and so I was privileged to know her for a few years, maybe 5 years or so. And when she died, we found this collection of seaweed in her dresser drawer. And my wife kind of knew that she had done this thing because she had, Margaret, her grandmother, had mentioned it. Actually, my background is a page from that seaweed collection.
Oh, is
Uh,
that what that is? I love it.
yeah. So we didn't know what to do with it. We really didn't. We knew that she had done it on the Isle of Man and that she had been interned there during World War II. And we knew that her first husband had died during the war. But we really didn't know anything about why she was interned, how he died, other than he was on a ship that was sunk by a U-boat. That's the only thing we knew. Um, and nobody really wanted to ask her questions about it because her mother, Margaret's daughter, my wife's mother, had been separated from her parents during the war for several years. And so she had her own stories of trauma and loss. And she really didn't want to hear her mother's stories very much. And nobody wanted to kind of rock the boat, I think, is partly what it was. And also, my wife was young. Like most of us don't really care to hear those stories until we're too old to be able to ask for them.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, Margaret died, and we found the seaweed collection, and we thought, wow, I mean, it was an amazing collection of seaweed. There was about 30 pages that look like this, all different species. And we thought, well, maybe we'll find an oceanography program or something we can donate it to. And we put it in our fire safe. And some years later, I started wondering so we had a son, I got interested in genealogy. And kind of out of that interest in my own past, I started to wonder, well, what was behind that seaweed collection? And what happened to Margaret's husband? And so this was around 2010 or so that I started researching this stuff, um, just on the internet and spare time at work or whatever. And the more I learned, the more engaged I became. And the story just drew me in. And I found that it was just so rich. And I just felt there was something more to it, though, for me. And I explore kind of generational grief or inherited grief. My mother was also hidden away during the war, but very different circumstances from Yvonne's mother or her grandparents. And I think that I don't know. The issue didn't come up until I was writing the story to realize, maybe this sort of what seemed like a low grade depression in myself for a good portion of my life and my attraction to stories that deal with sadness in some way. I mean, even as a teen, I loved Lord of the Rings. But my favorite characters were the elves in Lord of the Rings because they had this very traumatic history and a sadness to everything that had to do with them about what they were losing. And even the whole story really has to do with loss of sort of a golden age. And I never understood why I had that interest. And in writing this story, I realized maybe I inherited something from my mother, even though she never talked to me about her experiences when I was young. And maybe that is kind of resonating and wants to come out. And maybe that's what's behind my emotional connection to the story that I wrote.
I understand all too well. My dad didn't talk about his World War II experiences when we were young, except for occasional um, when I had finished the diary of Anne Frank and I asked him, what happened to her? All he said was, she died. End of conversation. Okay. But I do understand that somewhere embedded in us, right, is that experience. You know, it goes through several generations from what I understand. And here we are dealing with it, which is good rather than just experiencing it. So I'm glad you've been writing about it. Um, what was the experience like writing it down?
It was, in a way, I mean, writing The Tides of War was to a small degree like writing that poetry after my wife died, I think.
Um,
Um, I was trying to capture the story, of course. But what was most important to me, especially there's a section in there about Ireland and the people of Western Ireland during the war and what they had to deal with. That there were a lot of ships that were sinking off the coast of out in the North Atlantic, and um, bodies would wash up on the shore, and people were poor, and yet they would recover the bodies. They would pay to bury the bodies with money they didn't really have, and so that really struck me too, trying to understand what was it that drove people to want to take care of these bodies. Um, and so that also there was sort of an emotional aspect to Irish culture, especially Western Irish culture, that I had to be really careful to make sure I wasn't projecting my own feelings onto why they did what they did. And I found out that my sense of it was accurate. I mean, Ireland has gone through so much grief and trauma of their own over centuries. And people in the West, especially, just led very, very difficult lives. They were always losing people at sea. And so they had a kind of a special affinity for people who died at sea. And they took care of them. And so I wanted to kind of capture that also, sort of the emotional quality of that aspect of their culture. And it was something I really resonated with personally, because of my own, as we talked about, this sort of low level grief that seems to sort of be in the background, not all the time. I mean, I'm a happy person, but it's kind of there sometimes, and it tends to come out in my writing. So
yeah. Um, did you live in Ireland at all?
no,
Mm.
we'd always wanted to visit, and sort of the excuse for doing it last year was partly research for this story. I wanted to go to the places where bodies have been found and the cemeteries where there's unmarked graves of people who were buried, but no one knew who they were because they had no identification on them.
Right. Wow. We learned so much about the war every time someone like you, right, is willing to write their family's story. And it's just amazing. I had no idea about Ireland's participation in helping these poor dead souls be buried.
Yeah.
Yeah, my goodness. Is there a museum at all there, or is it just a sort of unmarked graveyard?
Well, Ireland, no. Ireland, there's unmarked graveyards, but Ireland was really sort of, in many ways, a witness to the war. I mean, officially they were neutral. Unofficially, they weren't quite, but they never were directly involved in the war. The Isle of Man, however, was a different place, and that's where my wife's grandmother was interned, and that was part of the United Kingdom. And there were thousands of people who were interned there for a couple of years,
Wow.
and they were anyone who was of Jewish or sorry, not Jewish, but German or Italian later ancestry ended up interned on the Isle of Man or in a few camps in England itself. And so in the Isle of Man, there is a museum that's a large part of what they do is dedicated to the internments. And so there's a huge amount of information and documents and photographs and all
Mm.
sorts of things. I mean, the Isle of Man is, I didn't even know where it was. So for the record, it's about halfway between England and Ireland in the Irish Sea. And it's kind of a semi-autonomous part of the United Kingdom. But during the war, they have these camps. It was a holiday destination before the war, and it kind of is again. So, yeah, so they have a museum.
Yeah, my goodness. I know my dad, when he was first going overseas, ended up in England, and
Mhm.
um, we drove around to where he was kind of stationed before he went over to France and Germany,
Mhm.
and it was it meant so much to him to be able to take us with him onto this little journey to places that he had where he'd been stationed. So I know that it means so much to people, even though, right, you can't tell what actually happened there today. There just is echoes of it. You
Mhm.
just experience it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would love to have been able to go back with Margaret
Yeah.
and and go to the places. One of the things that I wrote about was trying to find the places where she lived when she was interned. Um, and we had information about, we actually, there was a record of where she had lived, but we didn't know what that meant. I mean, because the British had kept records. So there was
Oh,
the name of a hotel called Snaefell, and
oh,
they said that she had stayed at Snaefell and that she had stayed at Tower View. Um, so we had to find out where those were. And we did. And so Snaefell Hotel is gone, but they were building apartments there called Snaefell, right on the same location. So that was kind of nice. And then the Tower View turned out to be someone's private home.
oh.
And it had a plaque on the wall next to the door that said Tower View. And somebody helped us find that. So that was kind of neat to be
Yeah,
able
I bet
to
it
locate
was.
those things.
Oh my goodness. I bet
Yeah,
it was. And I'm sure you took pictures.
we took pictures. The other thing that was interesting that we discovered was that um, my wife's family kind of knew that Margaret had converted to Christianity, but we didn't really know anything about it. Well, we found her baptism record on the Isle of Man,
Oh,
and then her confirmation in a different church on the Isle of Man. And the woman who at the museum, this an archivist named Wendy Thurkettle, who was really wonderfully helpful for us. She found those and she said, baptism is one thing. People will be baptized just so they can join the church and feel like they're a part of it. But she said confirmation is different. Confirmation means she really was committed in some way. You don't have to do that to be a part of the church.
right. And
So
she was originally Jewish.
she was originally Jewish, but never religious.
Yeah.
She grew up in a pretty secular family in Germany, And they had lived, a lot of German Jews were not necessarily religious at all. They happened to be Jewish, but they were German. And that was part of I think, the disbelief for some people in Germany that this could happen to them because they didn't even consider themselves Jewish. Her husband, Ernst, had never set foot in a synagogue until his son decided he wanted to be bar mitzvah. And so at 13, when his son was 13, was his first time ever in a synagogue.
Oh, wow.
My wife's mother wrote a story about that, just kind of a beginnings of a memoir. She died actually before Margaret did, from lung cancer.
Mm.
But she had begun writing a memoir for her kids. And so what she did complete was some of the stories of growing up and the
Sure.
beginnings of the Nazi regime there
Oh,
and how
wow.
it affected them. So,
Amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh my goodness. I'm kind of speechless. Sorry. What an amazing history. And I gather you still have those writings, the mem
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, somebody translated, well, she wrote that in English,
Okay.
but I also have, she kept a diary, and Yvonne's my wife. Yvonne's mother kept a diary when she was hidden in France and then escaped to Switzerland. And she wrote 15, 20 pages about her escape,
Oh my goodness.
every detail, slipping in the mud and climbing this and seeing somebody on the ridge and, all of these things. I mean, it's like out of a movie. It's amazing.
Goodness. This is truly a treasure to have that kind of documentation. Not everybody does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in doing all of this, um, I'm sure. How do the rest of your family feel reading what you've written? What is their response?
Well, my wife's father, who's, this was on my wife's mother's side. My wife's father, he's very happy with it, and he thought that Margaret would be very happy with what I wrote as well. I really wanted to honor what happened to her grandparents, and because it was a story that I don't think anyone in the well, I shouldn't say anyone, but few people in the United States know about the internments,
Right.
or about the British putting people on ships and sending them off to the Dominions, to Canada and Australia. Um, People who had come to the U.S. to England for refuge, for the most part, and some of them died, and like my wife's grandfather. And that was that was a tragedy that became very public, but not as public as it could have been. The investigation to what happened was sort of whitewashed by the British government at the time, and
There was a lot of that going on.
yeah, there always seems to be.
Yeah.
So it's really a story that I haven't seen told before.
During the war, Great Britain held a conference about what was happening uh, because the Nazis were killing all these people, and they held it in Bermuda, where my grandparents lived, right? And
Huh.
and it was an international conference, and no Jews were invited, including my grandfather, who's perhaps the only Jew on the island. No, and nothing much came of it because they really wouldn't go into the real depth of what was happening and do
Yeah.
something about it. So I understand very well that, people suffer because of it, for sure.
Yeah, and one of the parallels that I drew in the story is even today, I think we don't hear very often the stories of the people who are, say, stuck at the southern border. I mean, and that's an enormous and complicated problem. And I'm not, for the record, I'm not saying we should just let them all in. I don't know what the solution is for that. But but yeah, I mean, people have fled, death and terrible situations, and they risk their lives to come somewhere, hoping that they can find safety, and then they often don't. They come with hopes, and then those hopes end up destroyed. And my wife's grandfather died just because we don't know really what happened exactly, but there were these tribunals for thousands of people in who were British, but in England, but were German nationals. And many of them were released, but many of them weren't. And it really depended on the individual magistrate, because when the government organized these tribunals, they didn't create any sort of rules or guidelines to go by. So everybody just went with their own personal prejudices or concerns, these various magistrates. And many times somebody they would write on the record that they were released, they were a Jewish refugee from Nazi oppression. We don't think they're a risk to the country, and they would release them. But in the case of my wife's grandfather, they didn't mention anything about the fact that he was Jewish. And they just decided that they just said he seems to be of poor character, and we think he's a threat, and he should be immediately arrested.
Oh my goodness.
And there were only, out of 65,000 or so people who went before tribunals, they only arrested 569 of them. And my wife's grandfather was one. We don't really know why. We don't know what went on in the courtroom.
Right.
I can only speculate that maybe he lost his temper. I know that he had one. Maybe he lost his temper. He was so frustrated, and the judge decided he didn't like him. Who knows? We really don't know. But he ended up dying as a result on this ship called the Arendor Star. There's a lot. Unfortunately, there's a lot that I can only speculate. I can only find records of what happened, but I don't often know why. So,
Well, even so, it's enlightening as to what happened and how it happened. And I really appreciate that you've gone to all this trouble to research and find out as much as you can and write about it so that the rest of the world can see, what it was like and how it echoes, right?
yeah.
Down the years. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't talked about?
I guess what I would like to do is just suggest that people read the story.
Good. How can they do that?
So they can go to hiddencompass.net, hiddencompass.net. And if you scroll down to just a little bit down the page, you'll see the tides of war, and the seaweed photo that's behind me is there, and my name. And they can just click there and read the story. And then the other thing that I'd like to encourage people to look at, especially if they're grieving or know someone who is so this is my book, Voices of the Grieving Heart.
Yes.
And you can get it on Amazon. And it's 150 poems from 80 different people.
Oh,
And this was not a compilation of published poetry that I put together. These were all contributed to me by people who lost people they loved. And one of them is a Nobel, not a Nobel laureate, but a poet laureate from the state of Kansas. Another has his poetry at the DuPont station in Washington, D.C. And then there's others that had never been published ever and hadn't intended to. But they heard about my project, and they just felt that my book might be a home for what they'd written. And they just wanted to help other people by sharing their own experience of losing someone they loved. So it's I guess if I were anybody else, it wouldn't sound strange to say this, but I think it's a very healing book. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, thank you. Um, Many people need that these days.
yeah,
Yeah, they do indeed. So thank you. And thank you for all that you're doing. And I look forward to reading some of it. And perhaps we will stay in touch and see how things evolve over the next year or so and do this again.
I would love that.
All right.
And if Steven Spielberg is listening, I have a great story for him to tell.
You and me both.
It's true.
Stephen, are you listening? You better. Well, thank you again. And thank you, audience, for tuning in to the American Diversity Report podcast. And you will see this up on the ADR soon and in our September newsletter. Okay? See you then.
Great.
Yeah.